Hello and welcome to Political Debrief. I'm your host, Josh Oliverio. Today on the show, we're going to talk about journalism in Canada. Today, I'm speaking with David Akin, the Chief Political Correspondent for Global News. We're talking about why journalism is so important in Canada, what the state of it is, and why young people should care. Here's our conversation now. All right, and joining me now is David Akin, the Chief Political Correspondent for Global News. David, thanks so much for joining me.
Hey, Josh, how you doing?
So, my podcast focuses on, the issues in Canadian politics and how it affects Canada's youth. And I'm curious to hear from you. Why do you think young people should care about the state of Canada's news, or should they?
Well, I live with a couple of young people, young being, 19 and 21-year-old university students, my kids. And they're at home. And I know when I was 21, I think I was out of the house renting an apartment. But my son, who goes to university, Carleton University, we were just talking about this the other day. He's not sure how he's ever going to afford an apartment, let alone afford a house at some point in time. And we know, and we've known this probably for at least the last election, if not two elections, that the cost of housing affordability for young people, even at 19 or 20, or younger adults, 20, 24, 25, 30s, is a problem. It's really expensive to buy a house in even in small and mid-sized cities, let alone a big city like Vancouver or Toronto. And so to the extent that your politicians can do something about housing affordability, I think that right away puts some, skin in the game for young people to be concerned and take an interest in politics. And that's just at the federal level. The federal government has, some significant levers to pull when it comes to housing. But even right down at the municipal level, municipal politics, really for young people, now we're talking about public transit to sort of get around. We're talking about zoning bylaws. Are we going to be building affordable housing? Where will that housing be? Will it be close to schools? There's also so many reasons for I think, young people who probably more than, say, us old fogies like me, are going to need some government services, some smart government thinking about planning. Really makes sense for young people to be paying attention, not just to federal politics, but as I say, to municipal politics and provincial politics.
And so let's take a step back for a minute then. What would you describe as the state of Canada's news industry right now?
The state of Canada news industry is probably the way it's been since about, the mid-1990s. It's going through tremendous change. In the 1990s, I was part of the inaugural staff of the National Post, good old-fashioned newspapers. All of a sudden, Toronto had 4 newspapers, the most competitive newspaper market in the country. And so that was change at that point. The National Post sort of forced other newspapers to do things differently. I happen to be a technology reporter. We made that a specialty, and we really forced some smart technology reporting on our competitors. So that's the 90s. And then as I sort of went through as a tech reporter, I was there writing about the invention of the MP3. That's, again, how old I am. And so because I was a tech reporter, I was writing about all these inventions, these new technologies that now we just absolutely take for granted that, digital native generations just sort of assume about. And it was pretty clear to me that the big change in my industry for my job as a reporter, not as an owner or a publisher necessarily, is the velocity, is the speed at which you are receiving information, processing information, trying to figure out what the news is, and then writing about it and doing so in an intelligent way. So the platforms no longer newspapers. Now I'm on broadcast TV. We just got some new numbers about how Global National is doing on YouTube. We got a YouTube channel, 2 million subscribers, and we're getting 500,000 people watching our newscast on YouTube. That's not on television. That's on YouTube. I've got, my physiotherapist long ago cut the cable cord, and he watches my program. I think he's on Roku. We're also on Amazon Prime. So that's great. I'm glad to hear that my work is finding a platform, but it's other people in my organization that worry about where are we going to be, and they're being very smart about making sure we show up with our content where audiences are nowadays hanging around getting content, YouTube, wherever it may be. But I mentioned the velocity. So the first thing, if I'm covering an event, an election, I'm going to be putting something out on social media, live, possibly, or as it happens, or contemporaneously. That might move to a short little radio hit because people still listen to radio. And then we move into more longer form, a broadcast item or a web text. So you are constantly producing content. And as I talk to young journalists, I do this in my own practice, you're recycling content. You might have a good line, a good theme. You want to add on it, you want to riff on it, et cetera, et cetera. So state of the news business for me is about being smart and fast. And again, that's the way it's been for the last 20 years.
So you mentioned how, people are consuming their news in very different ways now, watching it on YouTube, following reporters on Twitter, different ways. Where do you see that going 10 years? I remember there was a comment by the president of the CBC a couple of weeks ago talking about how the CBC might go all digital within the next decade. Do you think that is an accurate prediction?
Yeah, I mean, it would seem to be. I mean, to be honest, we have some of the country's major newspapers or former major newspapers, the Post media titles, the Montreal Gazette, the Vancouver Sun, and so on. They're down to publishing 5 days a week, and even those papers are kind of thin. I'm a print snob. I grew up in the newspaper business, like literally, you have ink on your hands after, used to get a stack of newspapers this thick on my doorstep most mornings. So I loved reading newspapers. I love the serendipity of just like finding stuff you didn't know you were looking for. But it's pretty clear that there's not much of a future for a physical object on paper being consumed by current generation or my generation of readers. I don't get a newspaper. I haven't for a long time. I read online in digital form what are called newspaper websites. I don't know why we call them that anymore, but you know what I'm talking about. So I'll read the ottawacitizen.com. But yeah, I guess it makes sense that everything is just going to be delivered in a digital format. It's cheaper for the news provider, for the content provider, and it seems to be where consumers are. Now, I'm not sure what that particular CBC executive was talking about in terms of will they be on legacy TV, over-the-air antenna. I think that is disappearing as well as we move, broadband internet out into rural and northern Canada. I travel a lot up in the Arctic, and you still rely on good old-fashioned analog from time to time, radio, antennas to get communications between remote parts of communities in Nunavut or the Northwest Territories, less so in Southern Ontario. But even still, because I track government spending. There was just an announcement yesterday, the Ontario and Canadian government handing out $4 or $5 million to provide high-speed internet to some small towns in Perth County. That's like in and around Stratford. That's not, the remote wilderness. That's just small villages in southwestern Ontario that still need high-speed internet. So long as the infrastructure is there that people can get, easy, relatively cheap, high-speed internet, then that means we can move to, all digital, high-speed internet delivery of video content, all sorts of content. So yeah, I mean, will newspapers be around 10 years? I wouldn't want to bet that they will be. I'll tell you that. So it probably is all digital.
And you raise an interesting question. I've been speaking with some local journalists from across the country, and they're saying that with the removal of the physical paper medium and a shift to those online methods for local news, there might not be the same quality of journalism because there won't be as many staff. What do you think of that idea that local journalism is starting to kind of fade away?
I guess I'd have to look at each specific, but it would seem to me if you remove a major cost out of your local journalism operation, i.e. the cost of newsprint, the cost of publishing, the cost of delivery of that newsprint, that frees up funding for additional editorial resources, should you so choose. And content does draw people to content draws people to pay for things. I look at my friend Paul Wells, who left Maclean's and has now got a whole bunch of different projects going, his own newsletter, etc. And he's got people paying him just for a column once, and it's a good column. He's got good content. So there's a model where you create good content, and there will be people who will want to pay for it. So it means if you're operating a local journalism, and again, I started out with a 3 times a week newspaper, the Orangeville Banner. And when I worked in Orangeville, this is just north of Toronto, so we had a paper that came out, twice a week. And then there were two other papers that came out once a week. So I was in a competitive environment with basically 3 weeklies. We could only make the news once a week, and we try and scoop each other. There's no internet. There's no catching up if you get beat. And so we really made sure that we had better content than the other person. And that meant people read us. It was the Orangeville Citizen, and we did, as a group, did a pretty good job. And that meant advertisers and subscribers wanted to pay to be associated with our content. So that at the heart of it is what any news business is going to go through. There's certain kinds of advertising. This is why newspapers disappeared at the internet. That's classified advertising. That used to sustain local journalism. Absolutely, you can make a fortune with classified advertising, and you can't anymore. So you have to find different funding models. But at the heart of it is good, solid content. So if you're a local journalism outfit, and again, I don't know which one we're specifically talking about, but maybe you want to focus exclusively on municipal politics. Maybe you want to focus exclusively on minor sports. Pick a specialty. We're seeing that in a lot of digital-only sort of outfits, and just go to town on that, and you will find a deep vertical. And hopefully, it may not be a wide vertical. It may not attract a lot of subscribers, but you want to have those subscribers or those viewers hopefully contribute to your content. I suppose. Been a while since I've done local journalism. Recognize there's unique challenges there, but that seems to me the first place to start.
So then, talking about that change in how you're delivering the news, how do you think news organizations can further adapt the ways that they deliver the news to incentivize young people to follow the news, read the news, watch the news?
Well, again, it's I think, and I guess we'll see. I'm certain that, I was a news junkie when I was 16, 17 years old, but I know that most of my friends were not. But I'm pretty sure that as my friends turned 40 or 45 years old, they found a reason that, oh yeah, I should read about how my investments are doing, or whatever it might be, or what my politicians. So I suspect news consumption, just naturally, people get interested in news consumption as they get a little older. They have, they're not distracted by whatever else is going on online, whatever. Again, using my son as a sounding board, I was saying, should I be getting on TikTok? I've got not a bad Twitter game. My Insta game is like so. And my son was saying, no, TikTok is just, even though the New York Times just showed up on TikTok. And I mentioned TikTok because apparently that's where a whole lot of younger people like to watch content. So I'm probably not at this point in my career going to up my TikTok game. We've got one of my colleagues, Rachel Gilmore. She's keen about doing the whole TikTok thing. Great. She can carry the gold banner in the TikTok. Yeah, I'd like to up my Instagram game, but mostly just to do, like, what's the point of that? And that is to say that I'm trying to sell my brand, which then is valuable to Global. And so my brand, I hope, is you can follow me or read my stuff, and I know politics, not just federal politics. I'm just doing some work, and I've got some meetings for the Alberta election that's coming up in less than 100 days. So you come to me for some intelligent discussion about politics. I'm going to be really that deep vertical again. I'm going to get into nominations, and I just had an article online, broadcast and online piece. Let's break down the new riding maps, and let's specifically look at, wow, how's Pickering Uxbridge changing into Pickering Bricklin? So that's my brand. I'm all politics. I'm not putting up a lot of photos of my kids or commenting on. I might comment on the Blue Jays or the Buffalo Bills from time to time, but generally, if you're gonna hang around with me online, it's going to be politics, and I hope you can trust the coverage or whatever I'm doing. And when I say trust starts with a willingness by me, the journalist, to say, I just got that wrong. let me correct the record. That I think is a very important component of trust. And it's one of the reasons I think newspapers had higher ratings of trust than, say, television news programs. Why? Because on page 2 of a newspaper every day, they printed clarifications and corrections. In other words, we got something wrong, let us correct the record. And you really didn't see that much on a 30-minute newscast. You don't see something at the end of the newscast where saying, okay, now we just want to fix some of the goofs we made last night's newscast. So trust, that's part of my brand. My brand is politics, and my brand is a commitment to being fair. That's not objective. I don't believe in objectivity, but fair. So on any given day, I'm going to wake up and say, you know what, today the New Democrats might have a good idea, or the Conservatives might have a good idea, or the Liberals might have a good idea. I'm not locked into waking up and having to pick on or carry the water for a particular party or whatever. I'm open to tell me what you got, and I'm going to try to report it fairly, try to report it accurately, and I'll give you a fair shake. And again, I think audiences do respond to that. I know it's one of the reasons that I've been hired by a few different organizations is they think that is a good business proposition to attract consumers of all ages, young people who may be a little more cynical looking around the day, or older people who are cynical these days. So.
All right, David, my quick second last question for you.
Sure.
I read an article saying that the average person reads an article for 2 seconds and then clicks off it. Like they read the first little bit, then they click off it. Mm-hmm. Has that changed how you write your articles online?
No, because that's the way it was, again, back in my newspaper days. People would read the headline. They might read the first 2 or 3 paragraphs, and then they're flipping the page. I remember one stat, 30% of this is again from the 90s, when you had like thick newspapers with different sections. So there'd be the A section would be the news. The next section would probably be business. The next section after that would be sports. Then there might be what was called lifestyle sections. And, if you get to the next sections, only 30% of whoever bought that newspaper is getting to the business section. Only 30% is getting to the sports. Even less than that is doing the arts section. So you had to recognize, again, you've always had to recognize as a journalist, you're fighting for attention and you're fighting for interest. So one of the things that, again, when I talk to young journalists is if you're going to attract some attention and get people at least 2 or 3 paragraphs down, is one of your top paragraphs has to be what I call the who-gaff paragraph. And I learned this very on from an editor who would yell at me, David, you need to who-gaff that really boring story about city council. And who-gaff stands for, it's a bit of a rude term, it stands for who gives a flying fudge, if you know what I mean. So you need to right away tell the reader, why should you spend more than 2 seconds or 5 seconds on what I'm telling you? So that's very important for a our newscast. A million people might see it. A major platform like globalnews.ca, millions of people might see that, and you're trying to get it's a broad-based thing. So it's not really changed my writing. It's just constantly reminding yourself there's a lot out there. Tell someone why this is interesting.
And my last question, David Akin, if you had to go back and tell your young self, like 14, 15-year-old self, a piece of advice, what would that advice be?
Well, I wanted to be a history professor. That's what I thought I'd be. And this job I have is pretty good. So I don't know. I just sort of got a little distracted. I was sometimes a really good student at university. Sometimes I was having too much fun doing other things, running the student paper or whatever. So I'd probably tell myself, be a little less distracted. Actually, you know what I would have done back then? Learn more languages. Like when you're 15 or 16 years old. My French, I can understand, say, Stephen Harper's French, if you know what I mean, but I have trouble understanding a lot of native Quebecers. So I wish I spoke better French. And maybe, to be honest, maybe I spoke an Asian language. I would say go back and learn to speak another language. I just think I'd be a better reporter. I'd be a better citizen. And I just would find so many more fascinating things. So that's what I do.
Awesome. David Akin, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hey, no problem, Jess. Good luck with the podcast, man.
And that's it for this episode of Political Debrief. Thank you so much for listening. If you want to get some more information about David and journalism in Canada, I would invite you to take a look at the blog post that I wrote up about this. There are some additional links for you to do some research if you're interested. That link is down below. As well, I would invite you to subscribe to Political Debrief on YouTube and your favorite podcast platform to get a notification whenever we post a new episode, and feel free to follow me on Twitter at Josh Oliverio to stay in the loop. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode.